welcome back. Um, I'll just start with a couple of introductory remarks and we'll get into our discussion. So, in the first part of our discussion on Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, um, previous video, we'll link it below, we covered his account of the state of nature, the commonwealth, which emerges through man's covenant with his fellows, as well as how Hobbes radically transforms the way we think about man and society by positing the individual as alienated from the world around him. As in our first part, we are today interested in understanding how Hobbes is, in a sense, prefiguring later ideas and developments through his notion of the individual and subsequently through his reflection on the enterprise of government. Part 2 of the book is all about this enterprise. Here, Hobbes treats various questions and problems of commonwealth, arriving at a fuller expression of the sovereign and his special dispensation. As we discussed in part 1, Hobbes' project is fundamentally negative. The state of nature is more of a sword of Damocles than something humans attain towards. The final cause of man is to unite in commonwealth, the object of which is to abridge freedom and not necessarily to realize a qualitatively different, freer state of affairs. But if we ask what is liberal in Hobbes, one of the things we might point to is that he conveys the idea that society is self-legislating, although perhaps in a roundabout way. The commonwealth comes about through covenant. The sovereign is the persona civitatis, which concentrates and represents the people. The sovereign power is still the sole legislator, but, quote, every subject is the author of the actions of the sovereign, unquote. To cast the sovereign as entirely above or without society would also be misleading, as the sovereign is fundamentally part of the overall organism. The sovereign power is the, quote, soul of the commonwealth, unquote. And once it departs the body, quote, the members no longer receive motion from it, unquote. Casting a picture of kind of a concentrated whole of which the sovereign is a very important part. So these are some of the ideas that we're going to try to cover today. Sovereign power, what does that mean? Where does the sovereign get his powers from? What is the relationship of the sovereign to his subjects? All of the things that Hobbes addresses here. Of course, we're not going to be able to get to everything because he spends a lot of time on the minutiae of civil law and so forth. But I'll just leave it at that as a quick introduction. Tucker, you're free to add anything you'd like.
Maybe as an addendum, because I think we only touched on it in a cursory manner the last time we reviewed. When we talk about what is liberal about Hobbes, I think it's important to situate what is said here in a very revolutionary context, in a very kind of breaking through. I mean, this is I guess you could say that about everything. Well, this is really new for its time, but this is really, in some sense, a revolutionary, a turning over of previous doctrine. So it's important when we're looking at Hobbes to situate him very nicely in kind of the broader tradition, and he's going to give a lot of arguments against the prevailing notions of his time. When we later get into the section of civil law, he's going to articulate how his system kind of differs, and he argues against scholastic or Aristotelian conceptions of natural law, right? And because for Hobbes, he will say, right, no, all law is only law insofar as it's enforced by the sovereign, and if something is not upheld by the sovereign, there is no such thing as natural law, right? Or he says that there are natural laws, but only insofar as really the sole legislative power is what the sovereign dictates, right? So again, this is when we talk about one person. Hobbes is going to advocate for one person being the ruler, but you're going to see in here beginnings of very liberal ideas, things like consent of the governed. I mean, that's going to kind of be almost outlined in here in very brief. And just his general framing of things, I think we said last time, is we're going to begin to see, and hopefully we can focus on that. How does this go beyond Hobbes? How does this go beyond his own project of, which in some sense is justifying the rule of the king, right? After Cromwell's rule in England. But how does it go really beyond? How does it kind of expound itself and unfold itself into the thinkers going forward. So that's just my brief addendum there.
We'll proceed right into it. The Commonwealth and sovereignty and what that means. Again, like we said in the beginning here, Hobbes is engaged in a mostly negative project. And so Commonwealth is an instrument of abridgment. It is an instrument of the natural laws, which are over and against, they're applied over and against the passions. And these natural laws, they have to be enforced by, quote, the terror of some power, unquote. And this is even a view of power in the state, which is very pervasive today, that the state is a kind of necessary evil that abridges the worst aspects of man. And as we'll get to later, Hobbes foresees two ways in which a sovereign power comes about, by institution and acquisition. Of course, as we'll hopefully touch upon, these two are really not that different for him. They effectively mean the same thing. On the rights of the sovereign, we'll just start with this. Hobbes spends the second chapter of part 2 just listing out all the different rights which are, as he says, annexed to the sovereign. These rights, these powers are concentrated in the definition of sovereignty and sovereign power. And to exercise these rights is what it means to be a sovereign. A sovereign cannot give away these rights. A sovereign ceases to be sovereign in a very real sense if he does not annex these rights to him. And there are many of these, such as that the subjects can't change the form of government, the sovereign power cannot be forfeited, as I've just said, that no man can even protest the sovereign, and so on and so forth. One of these that I thought was very interesting, and I think is very relevant to the discussion today, is that it was number 4, the fourth reason or the fourth right of the sovereign, which is that the sovereign's actions cannot be accused by his subjects.
I had that start as well. Yeah.
For it is the subjects who, as Hobbes claims here, who grant him the authority to act as he does. Now, this is very interesting, and this is again, he's making a point about the authorship, which in the very next right he also brings up again, quote, foreseeing every subject is the author of the actions of the sovereign, the subject punishes another, namely the sovereign, for the actions committed by himself, unquote. That is what happens when the subject accuses the author of these actions, the sovereign. What he's really doing is accusing himself.
Yep.
So this is a kind of the way in which Hobbes is arguing here. And I'll let you jump in here in a second. But first thing that popped to mind when I read this fourth right, that you can't accuse the sovereign because he can only do what he's doing because you've granted him the right. I thought of the kind of paradox that comes up today when we talk about elections, which is that you can't complain if you didn't vote, because you had a chance to do what you wanted to be done, to have done what you wanted done. But you also can't complain if you did vote, because if the outcome is not what you wanted, well, you have assented to all possible
voting,
consequences by voting. So it's like maybe damned if you do, damned if you don't. The sovereign can do whatever he pleases to him. He cannot be accused. Why? Well, because he can only do what he does on account of you're giving him that right. So this is a very, very interesting way of arguing here, but please jump in.
I think in a couple of preceding sections before, he actually articulates this as a theory of punishment, where he says, well, the question is asked, how can the sovereign punish you, right? It's like, well, it's actually not the sovereign punishing you if you do something wrong, right? You are the author of your own punishment because you have instituted the sovereign, and so to go against the sovereign is to go against what you have instituted, and so, right, it's I guess you might call it like a performative contradiction. That's how you're justly punished, right? Yeah, I think this notion is very interesting, and maybe this is where we start to see implicitly we've smuggled something in with Hobbes. That's what I thought of. So the Latin term for republic, which is translated, is res publica, which means of the public affair. And this was as opposed to the monarchy as traditionally received was the private affair. The monarch owned the land, he owned the subjects, right? But Hobbes gives us a very different view of what a monarchy actually is. And it seems to be like he has an awfully republican conception of a monarchy, right? It's like even the sovereigns, the state of the sovereign is a matter of public affair, right? Because, well, how are we punishing you? You know, previously, why is the monarch punishing you? It's like, well, because you're inferior. He owns you. You're a slave to the state in some sense, right? If you're a citizen, it just means you belong. But you know, there's a kind of ownership. There's a relation more opposed to ownership rather than comradeship or something like this. But for Hobbes, it's very much, well, the sovereign punishes you because, well, you're actually punishing yourself. The sovereign's not punishing you at all. You did it to yourself. But in so doing, we're smuggling in this idea of the state becoming a matter of public affair. Really, I think this is a very radical turn, because now, instead of, you know, yes, the sovereign has the right to punish you, but the sovereign's rights are conferred, you know, by the institution of his subjects, right? So everything the sovereign does is both as a matter of the sovereign rights, the rights of sovereign power, but the rights of sovereign power are themselves a concern of the public, right? They're upheld by, I think, a kind of snuck premise of, well, the state really is a public institution. And I think Hobbes, throughout later sections, is going to take some pains to try to reestablish a notion of private and public. But I think here it's very clear that, you know, this kind of this public, this notion of public affair of the res publica is being snuck into monarchy in a way that perhaps it hasn't been before. So that was one thing that I thought of when it was like, you are ordaining the sovereign, and a lot of things in this system are going to follow from you ordaining the sovereign. So really, this assumption is going to kind of cascade down, or poison. You know, it's going to be at the roots, poisoning the roots as we go. And maybe that's one thing that we, as I said at the beginning, we can look at. How is this going to explicate itself further, right? If we look at problems Hobbes takes up, and then problems that people take up after him, someone like Rousseau is going to take up the idea of, you know, kind of matters of the state being very public. And it's very easy to see, I think, how one might appropriate the language of Hobbes to actually justify a far more democratic or republican system of government than he envisioned.
No, exactly right. And yeah, he is smuggling in the idea that, you know, the subject is ultimately self-legislating,
Mm-hmm.
albeit through the sovereign, right? But it poses the possibility that we might cut out the sovereign. Of course, Hobbes will take exception to that, but it's not entirely clear why. But we'll get to his arguments on that later. But another point in this chapter where he kind of perhaps makes this mistake or is unaware of what he's saying is when he equivocates in a real sense between monarchy, democracy, and aristocracy. Because he says all government, whatsoever form it may be, if it be perfect enough to protect its subjects, is the same. That is to say, sovereign. Now, the impression that if I read it correctly, the reason why he's saying this is he's trying to dispel the notion of perhaps Democrats that they can get around certain problems of monarchy by opting for an assembly, for democracy, let's say. Whereas Hobbes is saying, no, you're going to have the same problems no matter what. But in the same vein, what he's also saying is that you don't, in fact, actually need the king for there to be a sovereign entity. So in trying to argue against maybe the advocates of assembly, he is saying, okay, well, if he's telling them if what is needed is sovereignty, if sovereignty is the glue that holds society together, well, we don't need a king to do that.
I think also maybe inadvertently this is an argument against perhaps the bourgeois revolution in England, right? Because the whole idea is that the king's, you know, having an absolute monarchy allows one person, the king, or the state, too much power. And so in order to prevent the state from encroaching, as was alleged by the Roundheads in the English Revolution and the English Civil War, we needed to have a republican form of government. And this was what people in the English Revolution, like the Levelers and even to an extent Cromwell himself, believed, which is why they didn't want a monarch, because it's kind of sovereign power, the ruling by divine right conferred upon a person too much authority. And I think you're right, but I also think Hobbes is saying, like, well, it doesn't matter if it's a monarchy or democracy or oligarchy. Sovereign power is sovereign power. You can't say that a democracy will wield any less power than a king will, right? And so by equivocating, he's hoping to, like, on one hand, but he's bringing up the form of democracy to the level, to the same sovereign powers of monarchy. So there's a big push and pull here on what he wants to do, and you can read it in a lot of different ways.
No, exactly. And I don't without jumping too far ahead, let's just give one of the arguments that he gives later on. He says that one of the problems that arises in assembly is, well, factionalism. I think you said it in the very beginning. He's arguing against factions. If you have an assembly of people, you have a multitude of different interests, groups of interests. People will perhaps naturally sort themselves into factions, and then what you have is not a single country, a single commonwealth governed by one assembly, but you have in fact multiple different factions governing multiple different parts of a country. The reason why he's saying that is because that is what's happening during this time.
Yeah.
You
But the
have
paradox, is that like, no, what he says, what makes a country is a sovereignty. So if you have a
exactly,
body, it's like either the body is sovereign or it isn't. So there's an interesting, there's like a very clear counter argument here to be given against Hobbes. But yeah, I think you're right.
yeah.
It is
No,
about,
yeah, he's
it is
going
about
after the
faction. Yeah.
factions of his day, but again, he's giving them some credence that, well, he's giving the idea of a sovereign assembly credence.
Mhm.
And that is already, he's let the cat out the bag at that point.
Sure. So, okay, if you don't mind, one part here. There was this is in section
Oh, wait, I just
16.
muted.
Oh, okay. So this is in section 16 of this, where he talks about the sovereign power being indissoluble, right? And I thought this was interesting, given by his comments later, where he talks about tyranny and all of these other monikers, which he actually just reduces to the ideas of complaints against various governments. But it's very interesting that here, right, Hobbes declares that, to avoid these kinds of faction, right, where he says in England it was divided between the kings, the lords, and the House of Commons, and if this division wasn't there, there'd be no civil war. And so in that sense, this authority must be indivisible. It must be possessed by a person. I wanted to ask, maybe get this question out of. It's very interesting. The ancient Greeks had the idea of tyranny, specifically of the tyrant. And tyranny, or being tyrannical, is actually a specific type of vice. And it was associated, one who was a tyrant was one who assumed power that was not due to him, right? So kind of the vice of pleonexia, which Hobbes mentioned in the first part. But, part of, well, just to give an example, there's a Greek myth, concerns about a king who he tells his servant, come look at my wife while she's undressing, because the king wants to show off how beautiful his wife is, and the servant says, no, this is not proper of me to do, right? And eventually the king forces the servant to go watch his wife undress, like in hiding in the closet. The wife discovers him and says, either I call the guards in and kill you, or you kill the king and you become the king, right? So the guy, he kills the king, takes the wife, and he becomes the king of this land. But part of the moral of the story is that the generations that proceed from this king become cursed, because this guy was a servant. He's a usurper, right? So seemingly the actual kind of meta narrative of the story is that this man is a tyrant, right? He has assumed authority that is unbecoming of him. He was just a servant. So on one hand, there's part of the element of the story that, the king violated his oath to the wife. But on the other hand, this guy, in assuming power, became a tyrant, and his progeny were cursed. So it's interesting to me how there's a very real idea in the ancient world that a person can assume too much authority as a sovereign. But for Hobbes, it's actually a virtue of the sovereign that he assumes as much authority as he can. Because in assuming as much authority as he can, he preserves the state, right? He preserves sovereignty itself. So I just, just maybe to get the discussion going of like, oh, what's the breakdown, right? I mean, Hobbes dismisses the idea of tyranny, but why is there no tyranny? Why has tyranny become almost a virtue for Hobbes? Like, what's a kind of a change there, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Um. Hmm. Yeah. It's certainly what you've just described does not mesh with his dismissal of tyranny. Um. Like at all. But interestingly enough, if you'll recall, he says in the chapter on the dissolution of the Commonwealth that one of the things which threatens dissolution is having common people simply read the Greeks and the Romans, right? So simply to read the Greeks gives them the idea that there is such a thing as tyranny. So again, if we think of maybe the rights of the sovereign power as all these different things gathered up together, annexed to one person, um, I don't know. Perhaps it almost is that the more of that right is annexed to the person, the more sovereign he is, and then the less likely the problems of the want for sovereignty are going to arise. And I'm almost compelled to think of, what you said in the beginning, which is that, or sorry, what you said in part one of this discussion, which is that the ancients had this idea of the goodness of being, that the more being something had, the more goodness it had. Um, that Hobbes is essentially treating the sovereign in this way, that the more sovereign being is annexed to the sovereign person, the better he is as a sovereign. And so again, Hobbes will not admit the possibility of the sovereign kind of giving away some of his responsibilities and powers. He offers what would turn out to be a critique of the American system of balance of powers, that there cannot be multiple institutions or multiple factions in a country, because these have to be, again, annexed together. Maybe this is completely wrong, but maybe he has retained some of this earlier way of thinking, right? Which is that the more sovereign being the sovereign power has, the better. That's what it sounds like. But
Yeah, because in chapter 19 here on the several kinds of commonwealth by institution and succession to the sovereign power, he says he classifies three types of government: a monarchy, democracy, and aristocracy. And he says there be other names of government in the histories and books of policy as tyranny and oligarchy, but they are not the forms of other government, but of the same forms misliked. For they that are discontented under monarchy call it tyranny, and they that are displeased with aristocracy call it oligarchy. So also they which find themselves grieved under a democracy call it anarchy. And yet I think no man believes that want of government is any new kind of government, nor by the same reason ought they to believe that the government is one kind when they like it, and another when they mislike it or are oppressed by the governors. So this is like, I took a very shocking sweep of the pen, dismissing the notion that there could be such a thing as overreach or something like this, right? Says, basically these things that you accuse your sovereign of, they have not fundamentally altered the government, right? All they have done is it's reflective of you not liking your government. And this is very interesting because this is something that doesn't exist in modern times right now. I mean, oftentimes, in foreign policy, it seems like we walk a very fine line in the West of when a country goes from authoritarian to a dictatorship, or when it goes from a presidential system to an autocracy or something like this, right? Or an oligarchy. So it's like we seem to notice that there's a kind of balance, and then really that the structure of government can actually change. But for Hobbes, this is just not there. And I think you might have a point with the being thing, but I think again, just good to situate Hobbes here in the context of this, where in the English Civil War, right? He notes there are a ton of factions in here, and so maybe he really just does see totalizing authority is the only way out of this kind of thing, and it's only later that we're going to see how maybe we could come to, when we get to like Montesquieu, of how we can come to balance power within a government, or how different factions in the state can balance sovereignty. But nonetheless, I think it's really interesting, this paragraph here, where it's just how very foreign to our ears now.
Yeah. Just to play with this thought a little bit more, you've raised it. He says it, I think, at several points in this part. That words like tyranny, oligarchy, these are just the mislike of actual forms of government. And another thing that he says is that, yeah, whatever the sovereign does, you are actually doing to yourself, and these kinds of things, so that perhaps an absolutizing monarch is really just, according to Hobbes's view, um, the Commonwealth exercising more and more control over itself. The more powers we vest into the monarch, the more we are legislating ourselves, the better off we are in this way. Because again, in Hobbes, you can almost just cut out the monarch a little bit. There's a loop that happens from the people and back to the people through the sovereign. And so for a sovereign to be absolute is for really the Commonwealth to be absolute. And why wouldn't we want that? Because the absence of this absolutism would suggest that we are playing with the state of war again, right? The gaps that exist in the Commonwealth are the state of war, the things that send us back to the state of war. And so to cover that up would mean to further absolutize, further develop the Commonwealth. So maybe this is what's going on here. But yeah, I'm also just juggling the thought here.
Yeah, I definitely also think there's an idea that goes here of there's a oneness to sovereignty, right? There's a paradox when you try to break up sovereignty, because the very nature of sovereignty, as we're going to see, is defined by its exception, right? There's a notion that's going to be taken up later in the history of political thought. But so in that sense, maybe to have devolved sovereignty would be a kind of contradiction for Hobbes, because by entailment of what the sovereign can do, which is to be totally above the law and promulgate the law, how can you, if you had two sovereigns, could they legislate about one another? Well, no. Well, it's like, how would the laws apply to them? How could you break something like this up? How can two people be not subject to the law? And so in one sense, it seems like he definitely implies that maybe it could happen, because he talks about Roman forms of government which vest sovereignty in dictators, and it's possible to have more than one dictator in the Roman Senate. You could have all sorts of dictators doing all sorts of things, or all sorts of kind of consuls and these kinds of things. So maybe there is a bit of a two competing notions here, where sovereignty must be one by virtue of it being exceptions, and so it can only be one. But also he seems to admit that maybe it could be devolved over two or more people or something like this. But just something to maybe consider more later. But
all right, while we're still talking about sovereign power and the fact that Hobbes is admitting here that an assembly can be a sovereign power, let's also go a little bit more into the different arguments that he weighs and why he thinks that a monarchy is superior to any kind of assembly. He says that assemblies, unlike monarchs, are subject to inconstancy due to the number of the people involved who may disagree among themselves. So again, it's the charge of factionalism. And he does raise some arguments that people might have against monarchy, such as the fact that when the crown moves from one generation to the next, in the moment of succession, there have been many instances where a child sat on the throne. And how reasonable could such a system of government be if it is a child that is reigning, a commonwealth? Of course, we have regents, but what's to stop the regent from simply killing
usurping,
usurping the throne and doing with the crown whatever he pleases? And Hobbes's way of treating this is very strange, because he says, this is what he says, quote, about the government under a child, if any contention arise to the disturbance of the public peace, it is not to be attributed to the form of monarchy, but to the ambition of subjects and ignorance of their duty, unquote.
Uh-oh.
So again, it's that whatever the sovereign does, or in this case doesn't do, you are doing or not doing to yourself. If the system of monarchy is failing, well, it is not because of a problem inherent to monarchy. It is because the subjects have done something to themselves. But then he turns around and says, well, if you're worried about children being the sovereign power,
Democracy is just like a bunch of children.
Exactly. The assembly is in the same condition as if the government were in a child. This is what he says. Now, here's, of course, charging assembly of being childish and discordant, assemblymen being discordant among each other. But later on, he really hammers this point in further, saying that, the sovereign is a guardian of subjects that are children.
Right.
So to suggest that an assembly could rule a commonwealth is to suggest that the subjects rule themselves. But the subjects are children, and so they will act like children in assembly with each other. And Hobbes even goes so far as to justify the authority of the sovereign by the commandment in the Bible, which says to obey one's parents.
Yep.
Like parents, the sovereign punishes and rewards the subjects, his children. And there's an interesting parallel perhaps here with Kant, because Kant also has this idea of the guardians, custodians of society. However, as we discussed in What is Enlightenment, when we reviewed that text, for Kant, the role of the guardian is to bring the subjects, to bring society to maturation, right? To raise them to a higher level of existence, to bring them into adulthood. There doesn't seem to be this notion in Hobbes.
And furthermore, the guardians for Kant they're everywhere. They're your school, they're your institutions, they're academia, they're whoever is just in a position to, facilitate this kind of maturation. So.
Yes, precisely. But I mean, surely Hobbes will agree that these kinds of institutions exist. True. But insofar as the sovereign is the guardian, the point is precisely not to raise the subjects out of childhood into adulthood, as it were, but to kind of keep mankind in this state of infancy almost. Perhaps this is my question, does he reject the possibility of these childish subjects coming of age in a certain sense?
I think he does reject this possibility. I had a note here on, this is back in the first chapter of the part 2, where I kind of noted that the state of nature in some way almost functions like a notion of total depravity that you might find in Calvinist or Reformed ways of thinking in Christianity, right? Where the state of nature is, because it's, I think we talked about in our first one, the state of nature is just like a state of entropy. And Hobbes makes clear that this state of entropy never goes away. We're always fighting against it. It's the tendency toward de-civilization, right? And instead, that a society is something in some sense which is constantly fought for, right? You're constantly surrendering your rights in the state of, or the right of nature. So I think in some sense, these notions of total depravity actually might find real resonance with Hobbes' political theory. And he cites, in this section, he cites Calvin several times on religious things. So I think that notion may actually have had some impact, where we talk about in the state of total depravity as articulated by Calvin. It's mankind is in such a state of sin that of his own volition he would never be capable of choosing God or choosing to accept the salvation of Christ. And this is, of course, where you get the further doctrines of Calvinism kind of explicating themselves from. But I think Hobbes relies on a similar turn when it comes to political theory, which is the state of nature is a state of total depravity, what we're constantly fighting against. And the sovereign, by virtue of being achieved and instituted, is that thing which is going to prevent society from collapsing into this state of entropy, right? That's the only thing, and only by having a complete sovereign that we avoid the chaos, like you said, the Damocles that is always kind of hovering above us. So I do think in a real sense, he probably would reject the idea that you could improve the nature of man to overcome these states of nature. So I think we might talk about liberty for a minute. Because he has a section on the liberty of subjects, and he makes clear that the liberty of the subject is the tendency to do whatever you want. So in some sense, liberty is going to have to be restrained by the sovereign insofar as you're at liberty. You by virtue of the right of nature have the liberty to just murder someone. But he talks about how in some sense this is an interesting turn, because he's going to talk about that. Here we go. He says, the greatest liberty of subjects dependeth upon the silence of the law. Where he says, as for other liberties, they depend on the silence of the law in cases where the sovereign has prescribed no rule. The subject hath the liberty to do or forbear according to his own discretion. And I think this is very interesting, because this is a notion that the American Constitution relies on very heavily, which is the idea of the Constitution applies primarily to the state, to the sovereign power. So things in the Constitution are not meant to be prohibitive to the individual, but prohibitive of the state, because it is assumed that on the individual level, there is the, as Thomas Jefferson says, right, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And these are just kind of at a base. And I think it's very interesting, this introduction of liberty, as in Hobbes, this liberty is almost like a negative thing. We're kind of fighting against it now. He's going to have a distinctively liberal explication of this when he talks about the various types of public and private institutions, where he talks about like merchants and things like this. And liberty is very good there, right? It's very good to have liberty in commerce, as I'm sure Hobbes would say. But here we already have, I think, a real prefigurement of something that's going to come later, namely the notion that it's, if the sovereign doesn't say anything about it, do what thou wilt, right? Whereas in scholastic periods, the natural law was actually meant as a kind of thing where it's like the sovereign didn't need to explicate these laws, right? The natural law, right, was something that was a matter of moral philosophy, right? And not necessarily, Aquinas has several divisions of laws. He has divine law and natural law, which is a similitude of the divine law, and then civil law. And natural law is above the civil law, but these kind of things, it's like natural law could include things that are not necessarily civil crimes. But for Hobbes, as he's going to talk about again, there are laws of nature in some sense, but really, the sovereign doesn't make a law on something. You're free to do whatever, right? Whereas in previous times, it's much more prohibitive, right? I would think, you're not, just because there's no law against it doesn't mean you can do it, right? As in regards to, it's unvirtuous of you to do this, but Hobbes rejects these kinds of notions. So maybe I'll just get your take briefly on this idea of how does the evolution of liberty come about from Hobbes, where we see here, where it's, you could, to paste the Irving Berlin term on it, negative liberty, right?
Yeah, it is distinctly liberal, and this is something that will continue to be taught in political science courses up until the present day, this distinction of positive and negative liberty. We see it here. I'll bring it back to our discussion on what Hobbes has to say about absolute sovereignty, because I think there's a very interesting point here, again, in line of what we were saying before, namely that maybe it is the case that Hobbes thinks of the corpus of laws as almost an island in the state of nature, right? Everything surrounding this body of laws is effectively the state of war, where everyone has a claim on everything, right? And everyone can, do as thou wilt. Everyone can do what he or she wants to do. But that ceases to be the case on this island of the laws. And so Hobbes views the absolutizing project of the sovereign as like the island expanding, right? Or like this territory that is the body of the law conquering more territory.
Yeah.
I hope this analogy is at all helpful.
No, I think it
But
does. It's like the sea is chaotic and you can do whatever you want. There's
yes,
the law of the sea. And then, but when you get on the island, when you get under the domain of King Robinson Crusoe, you better follow his laws, right?
essentially, yes. And so absolutizing then is not something for us to be concerned about, right? It is more people coming onto a bigger and bigger island, right?
It's
This island is
conquering
growing.
the entropy that's outside of it,
Yes,
right?
precisely. Yeah. Um, so, but then here's the problem, right? So for Hobbes, this negative freedom is not an affirmation. In our culture, we put a premium on uh, governmental moderation and precisely not legislating more and more things. Whereas Hobbes here is saying that really, yeah, you have your freedoms with respect to everything that's not legislated, but guess what? The point is to legislate these things. And the absolute sovereign is, a good sovereign if he's able to legislate more and more things. Very
Yeah,
interesting.
I think so, but also he's going to point out how, again, we don't use this as a slang word, but he points out that this is very liberal in the sense that when he talks about, because he's going to talk about different private and public types of organizations that might be formed in a commonwealth, and he talks a lot about economic institutions that might be formed, such as merchant guilds or import-export things like this. I think he actually has an argument of why the state should like prevent foreign trading on markets, because I think it's something as like domestically produced goods are more appreciated domestically, something like this. But he does have distinctive things where he talks about, it would be bad for, the king to interfere in specifically like merchant unionizing because it creates monopolies, and these monopolies are a bad thing. They don't serve the public interest, right? Because they rate, there's higher prices, and he says without these things, people could just trade at the price they want. And so I think in that sense, I think you are right, where it's like, on one hand, we have to fight against the moral degradation that comes from the state of nature. But on the other hand, there are some laws in terms of economic acquisition where, the king definitely should not, sponsor the creation of monopolies, right? In terms of kind of merchant sector marketing, right? Because these would not serve the public interest. So it's like the Leviathan, is kind of trying to consume, right? I guess the myth of the Leviathan is it's that sea monster which occupies the outer water, the dome, which is above Earth, right? So the Leviathan is swimming in the chaos, right? And it's kind of, could swallow the Earth or whatever, right? It's because of its immense size. But so as the Leviathan continues to expand, we're going to pump the brakes a little bit on where it should expand, right? So I don't think necessarily Hobbes wants an all-encompassing state, which we might say is kind of a conception of the state as an organism, like an amoeba, where in fascistic, I would say, political theory, this is exactly the state. The organism is almost like an amoeba of the people. It's an organism which constantly is assimilating everything to it. For Hobbes, yes, the state must expand to combat people's natural right or right of nature, but at the same time, it must not get so far as to do things which are not in the public interest. So I think it's interesting how these competing notions interplay, and really, it's a notion that still competes to this day, right? It's like, ever more we talk about. You see this in kind of contemporary discourse where people will say things along the line of, well, I really do like the market economy. I think the market economy is good because it allows for freedom. But, and then, they'll list a kind of laundry list of regulations that should be in order. So it's like, on one hand, well, these very things are the allure of the market is precisely that which allows the freedom of exchange and the freedom of kind of moving up, but also to it's required for a moral society for us to constantly impinge upon the functions of the market in order to prevent XYZ from happening. And I think this notion's in Hobbes. But one thing I did want to, perhaps I don't mean to go on along, but on the notion of negative liberty, I think it's there's some people now who have, or I think, negative liberty. We've kind of picked up on the negative impacts of this notion, and this has been addressed in the work of people like Charles Taylor. I'll shill for him again here, where he's going to talk about how, a kind of negative liberty denotes a seeming meaninglessness to our lives, right? Where the idea of the idea of positive liberty as an enabling condition for actually having a more fulfilled life, rather than a negative liberty of just doing what you want. And of course, Charles Taylor is going to point out the obvious thing of, well, because you have negative liberty doesn't mean you do what's good for you, right? Some things are enabling conditions. You might want what is bad for you. There might be things that are required to make you free. This is a notion that's going to be picked up in people like Hegel, right? And now I think it's become a significant thing. So I think this notion of negative liberty is really going to kind of continue to unfold itself in the liberal thinkers. And today, we might ask ourselves if we are still, if we're struggling with what does negative liberty provide us, if we are still fighting against kind of the do what thou wilt, as long as the government says that, doesn't say that you can do otherwise, right? So
I'll loop it back one more time to the island metaphor that we've been using, and also to add to your point here. Yeah, Hobbes is talking about negative liberty and maybe growing this island and absolutizing the realm of the sovereign's legislative activity to legislate more and more things. There is a caveat that Hobbes raises later on in the chapter on punishments and rewards. And this is namely, his answer to the very basic question, well, how is it that the sovereign can punish in the first place? And the answer that he gives is that, okay, so based on what he establishes in part 1, in making the Commonwealth, every man gives away the right to hurt others, but not to defend himself, unquote. Man's natural right to defend himself he retains in the Commonwealth. This is previously established. So then whence comes this right of punishment that the sovereign has? Well, in the state of nature, in the state of war, everyone has a right to everything and every man. Every man has a right to enact his own justice, or what he sees fit to call justice, including giving rewards and punishments. He can punish people in a certain sense of that word, however he pleases in the state of war. So then the subjects, in laying down their right of punishing others by coming into the Commonwealth, strengthen the sovereign's right to use his own right to exact punishment, as he should think fit for the preservation of them all. So again, everyone has essentially a right to punish others. But when we enter into covenant in the Commonwealth, all but one surrender that right. And that one is the sovereign. So here we get to kind of the exception, right? Like you said, this comes up in political thought later on as well. The sovereign is kind of the glue that holds the Commonwealth together, but its sovereign is also a kind of a leftover, a constant reminder of the state of war. It's like the sovereign himself is the sword of Damocles. If we're going to use the metaphor again, right? The sovereign is the state of war in society. And so there's, in kind of perhaps a monarchy or a sovereignty as such, the state of war, as Hobbes defines it, will always be with us, because it is on the basis of the state of war that the sovereign has the originary right to punish. We have all given up this right, but the sovereign retains it. And so, very interestingly enough, the sovereign himself is the state of war at the same time that he is keeping us out of the state of war. This is a very strange paradox, and it is accompanied by some other paradoxes in here as well. Any thoughts on that, or I'll just move on from there?
Oh, I think that does. I mean, just that's why Hobbes will say that the king is above the law, right? He who promulgates the law must be above it.
I'm looking for the quote. Yeah. No, that's precisely right. To suggest that the sovereign could be subjected to the law would be to suggest he could be subjected to himself. And how could this make any
Yeah,
sense? He
it's in
could
civil
punish
law.
himself.
It says the sovereign of a commonwealth, be it well, it's interesting, be it an assembly or one man, is not subject to the civil laws. For having power to make and repeal laws, he may, when he pleases, free himself from that subjection by repealing those laws that trouble him and making of new, and consequently he was free before. So he says it right there, right? He's the only free one, right? He's the only free man in this kind of system. And when we talk about one person being free and then some people being free and then all people being free, it's a notion, obviously, which Hegel's going to make kind of the basis of a political theory eventually. But, um, you know, one thing I did want to note, if I could really quickly, is that there's some interesting notions in this chapter 25 on counsel or of counsel. And I think if we're going to look at kind of liberal elements of Hobbes and how he's redefining the state, I think this is funny, where in here he's talking about the proper faculties of a counselor to the state, right? And one of the things that he says is that counselors must not give like rhetorically good speeches. He says, they must not give speeches tending to the stirring up of passion, because such reasoning and expressions are useful only to deceive or to lead him we counsel towards other ends than his own, and they are repugnant to the office of a counselor. And I think these notions are very interesting. We want to talk about, because in counsel, Hobbes himself is a counselor to the king, right? But when we're talking about, all right, so we have the sovereign power, and obviously the people are going to counsel the sovereign power. But I think it's very interesting to note that here Hobbes does away with rhetoric and does away with arguments, because he says, well, these arguments are supposed to appeal to the passions of a person, right? And I thought this was very interesting to just briefly contrast it with Aristotle's notion of rhetoric, where we talk about, actually, Aristotle says it's like really good for politicians to use rhetoric, and actually you probably learned it in lit school, his three forms of rhetoric: ethos, pathos, and logos. And actually, for Aristotle, all of the emotions have a rational basis. So, for example, one might actually be rationally angry about something, and it's rational to appeal to notions of anger about things when doing statecraft. But I thought this is very interesting because as Hobbes is going to begin, like you say, to expand the state over everything, he does have a notion of, well, there's a bureaucracy required for this. And this bureaucracy that Hobbes is going to lay out is a distinctively liberal bureaucracy. And already when we talk about, rhetoric or something like this, or Hobbes says, well, good counselors, they need to report the facts. They need to be sort of dispassionate. They need to be like experts, right, in their field and stuff like this. And he also says, and they need to be experienced, or they need to have practical experience. They can't just be book smart or whatever, right? And he says, the moral philosophers have no place in doing this kind of thing. So, I just want to briefly, before we kind of get to the final thing, what's your this does seem very, very liberal notion, right? The advisors to the state, the bureaucracy of the state must be transformed to make it more boring, right? To make them more passionless and dry.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. For one, he disagrees with himself on this point, because earlier he says that when it comes to the making and the maintaining of commonwealths, this is based on rules and not practice. Quote, "For though in all places in the world men should lay the foundation of their houses on the sand, it could not thence be inferred that so it ought to be." Unquote. So this would again suggest that, the book smart, the intellectuals do have a role to play in the maintaining of the Commonwealth. But then in this chapter on counsel versus commands, he like you said, he gives a very different view. What was the thing you said before this? Before the fact that the counselors have to be book smart? You made another point, and I thought of something, and now I just can't think of it anymore.
Like it requires experience.
For that,
Like rhetoric is something that appeals to like fundamentally irrational components of people.
yes, that's it. Yeah, the reason why he says that is, of course, is that the sovereign power, the point of it is to abridge the passions, to rein them in.
Okay, that's good.
And so for an orator in an assembly to appeal to the passions, it's the exact opposite of the sovereign power. So, yeah, Hobbes takes exception to that on that basis. And this is, of course, for him, it becomes another reason why assembly is inferior to monarchy, which is to say that can a monarch not be an orator? What is a
Yeah,
dictator?
he also says, right, that it's like, can the monarch not it's like, well, the assembly is very easily swayed. He says the assembly is very easily swayed by like speakers, good orators, right? But he says, well, the monarch, right? When he talks about of counsel, he says, well, in a democracy, the only people that can give counsel to a democracy are people that are within the democracy, which whatever. But in a monarchy, the king, he can go to whoever he wants to get advice. But it's like, well, is the king not capable of being duped? Right? Can the king not be also swayed emotionally? So again, very interesting notions. But I thought it was very funny the envisioning the bureaucracy of the state means we need boring politicians who are gonna not appeal to our passions because that would be irrational, and the sovereign must be a force of rationality against the irrational. And so the counselors to the sovereign and the ministers of the sovereign must be of a kind of stoic nature, right? Of an almost boring nature. So
Still, though, using the same arguments that the bourgeois revolutionists would use. We have precisely the point of the revolutionists is that we should rationalize about government and constitute a more rational government. But yeah. All right, so we've raised the number of paradoxes or seeming paradoxes in Hobbes's work here. One of them is the fact that absolutizing monarchy means something very different for Hobbes than it perhaps means for us. For Hobbes, it means the extension of the self-legislating subject, that is, the sovereignty as the author of society's will. For Hobbes, absolutizing sovereignty simply means the extension of the passions that are reined in by the sovereign reining in more passions and extending his rule, and by thus the self-rule of society in a certain sense. The other paradox is that the sovereign is, on the one hand, he who kind of keeps the Commonwealth out of the state of war, while also acting as the state of war on society through the exactment of punishments. So now one last paradox, or perhaps it isn't a paradox, that came up is raised in the chapter on nutrition. And really what it is it's about economy. And kind of the question we can ask of this chapter is a similar question we've asked of other chapters, which is, what does Hobbes say the duties of the sovereign are? And here, one of the duties is the procurement of commodities and the distribution thereof. Very interesting that he assigns the task of distributing economic goods to the sovereign. And on this point, Hobbes seems to think that we have two options. In the state of war, again, where everyone has a claim on everyone else, there is, as we've also discussed in the first part of this discussion on Hobbes, there is a sense in which everyone owns everyone else and everyone else's property, insofar as we can even think of property in such a state of nature, right? Everyone has a claim to everything else. And so there's a radical sense of mutual possession. This Hobbes calls the state of war, the state of nature. On the other hand, we have the commonwealth, the situation in which everything is owned by the sovereign, and it is he who decides the law of transferring goods, and it is he who establishes and maintains propriety. Again, this Hobbes calls common wealth, as opposed to the state of war, which is this radical mutual ownership. This plays at the different ways in which the state of nature is taken up by these Enlightenment thinkers. For Rousseau, famously, the state of nature is something very different. And I'll just quote very quickly from the second part of the Discourse on Inequality, where Rousseau writes about the state of nature. Quote, "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not any one have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all and the earth itself to nobody.'" Unquote. And so while for Rousseau, the state of nature is something that we want to attain towards, not something that existed in the past, but that we want to realize our natural being, for Hobbes, it is something that we want to escape. But for Hobbes, interestingly enough, the state of nature is a kind of propertyless state of affairs where everyone exercises a claim on everything else. Perhaps in a similar way that Rousseau is talking about the state of nature in the passage I just quoted. And yet, Hobbes sees fit to call the opposite, where everything is owned by a sovereign and the sovereign establishes clear delineations of property. Hobbes calls that state of affairs common wealth. And I thought this was an interesting paradox. Do you think this is a paradox? I want to know what you would have to say about this.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. The Rousseau thing is very interesting. It's like we want to actualize that state of human nature where we no longer have to, think of fencing these things off, right? Or something. But for Hobbes, you definitely have the idea that ownership is a kind of it's a kind of game we play. And it's a kind of game where the sovereign must set the rules for us, right? And I suppose an analogy you might think is that you see two hyenas fighting over a gazelle or something. Does it even make sense to say that one of them owns it, right? What would that even mean, right? Or even in human terms, if it's like if you have a property with your township, and then your property is conquered, right? It's conquered by a foreign power. Does it really mean anything to say that you own this land, right? So I think for Hobbes, he would say no, absolutely not, right? Ownership only means something when we've attained under the sovereign power, which is why he says in the part of the civil laws, if a community is governed by customs and then is conquered, they are no longer governed by those customs, even if they happen to stay in place. They're governed by the law of the sovereign. So when we talk about the competing tendencies here, it's like, maybe in some sense that this just goes to show that the notions in Hobbes are far less determinate in their conclusions than Hobbes wants them to be. That once these kinds of problems are raised, notions as might think of them as, kind of being critical of societal constructs of property or something like this. One Hobbes brings a critique of, well, does property even exist if we don't have a sovereign? Or, does it even make sense to say of these things without an absolute power by which we can appeal to recognize the division of property? Once we have embarked on a critique of society, as perhaps Hobbes is doing here, right? We've let Pandora out of the box, and now Hobbes, as you're right, it's like the one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. For Hobbes, it's like, well, we need the absolute state in order to attain the, the idea of property, because without this, we have a society that there is no property, there is no propriety. So the commonwealth we must totalize. We must totalize our assets to the sovereign in order so that we can actually have such things as property, right? So that we might have propriety, is what he says. And then for Rousseau, he's like, you're right. The state of nature is this radical kind of mutual possession, but that's what we want, right? So, I'm not sure, Hobbes definitely doesn't see it as a paradox. And maybe it's not so much of a paradox as people are drawing very different conclusions once Hobbes begins on his critique of society and critique of the state and civilization and sovereignty. And once people, are going to kind of pick up the bones from this and take it in different directions. And Rousseau is going to be one of these people, and later liberals are going to be these people. John Locke's going to talk about these kinds of things. So, yeah, I'd say that's maybe not so much a paradox, but maybe so much as this is opening a problem that's going to be grappled with by people, as to the present day.
I think you're right. I think you're probably right. Maybe it also shows us the indeterminate meaning of the word commonwealth. Someone might understand that to mean, wealth held in common, but as you point out, it's about establishing property, wealth in the first place. And how could you even have the notion of wealth in a state of nature where everything belongs to everyone? Wealth in one second is your poverty in the next.
Right.
So this, the commonwealth, as in the state of affairs, which is guaranteed by the sovereign, cuts through that and actually makes the acquisition of wealth possible in the first place.
Yeah, because remember, as in the first one, to claim something as yours is to try to claim a right to something. And a right to something only exists as a part of a covenant, and we can only enter covenants when we are out of the state of nature. All right, so as we're wrapping up, I think you're right to point out that there are a lot of paradoxes in Hobbes' work. And we might ask ourselves, all right, what have we set to do at the outset of this work? The outset, we set to explain human nature, which would give us a better understanding of explaining the nature of the state and how it is best to govern a state, right? And perhaps the value of Hobbes is not so much that he provides a rigorous and scientific, coherent theory of political thought, but I think we would be remiss to say that he didn't raise a lot of problems in the process of engaging upon. This really is a critique of the state, right? It is examining the possibilities of what are the possibilities of there being a state. Instead of treating the state as if it just exists, we're actually going to look at what is required, what is antecedent to the state, what do these things mean? We're going to kind of really embark on a critical project of critiquing statecraft and how one ought to run a state, how the state is composed, etc. So what is if there are lots of paradoxes, what is the meaning of all of it, right? And I think for Hobbes, perhaps in some way, he's obviously going to be writing a bit of an apologetic for the restoration of Charles II, and maybe in some way talking about how we might avoid a situation to the Civil War. But if we're interested in situating Hobbes in the liberal project, we're going to be interested in, and I think we've done that, in poking out how these problems that Hobbes brings up, such as who can possess sovereignty? Does it need to be one, or does it need to be everything? And in arguing for that it needs to be one, Hobbes actually maybe inadvertently argues that it can be many, right? Or, what does it mean? What does civilization mean? Civilization is not just something that's there. It's actually a counter, it's actually a counter to the tendency toward entropy, toward chaos, right? What does sovereign power mean? And these kinds of things. We're going to bring all sorts of seemingly contradictory notions. And so, nevertheless, we have all these things. We have begun to set the ground for the liberal thinkers who are going to come after Hobbes to take up his project, to take up his problems and his questions and his starting places And we're going to see, we've already seen how a lot of what Hobbes talks about is, going to be lend itself quite nicely to future formulations of Republican movements in, like that of Rousseau and in kind of the French Revolution, or, theories of self-legislation that we've seen in Kant, or in theories of people being free as long as they have sovereign power that's going to be taken up under Hegel, and etc. Right? So this is, as we said at the outset of reading Hobbes, this is such a foundational text, and it's a foundational for a reason, because Hobbes is going to think of politics in a fundamentally different way than was previously thought of. And in bringing his critique of sovereignty and of human nature, he's kicking the ball down to directions that, as you said, he may have not wanted it to go. But I think that is part of the beauty of Hobbes' work, is that as you read, it's quite easy to see how these things can lead to other, how they're going to lead to future developments. And so in that sense, it's almost essential to look at, all right, where do these things take their root? So an appreciation of Hobbes as a liberal thinker is perhaps not an appreciation of his commitment to human rights and democracy, but really an appreciation of how he is going to raise problems that make the possibility of liberalism as a political movement begin to rear its head.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Hobbes is rooted in his time, and the paradoxes point to how these problems are kind of springing up as a result of the events around him. And he grapples with these problems, and he points to the process of development in them. And this is fascinating, and this is something that we're going to be looking for in the other texts we're going to read.